Welcome back to my channel. My name is Dean, and on this channel I talk about biblical theology for normal people. And today I want to talk about something that's pretty normal in my household, and that is dealing with autism. My son, one of my sons, is on the spectrum, and I've talked about that a few times here on my channel. And today was pretty rough. This morning was really rough. One of the worst mornings we've had in a while. Sometimes there's something that my son wants to bring with him to school, and it just gives him a sense of comfort and helps him to be able to cope. And if he doesn't have that thing, regardless of, whether it's a toy, a piece of clothing, today it was a hat, if he doesn't have that, he gets a lot of anxiety and he doesn't know what to do with it. And so it just comes out in anger and screaming in tears. And that's what happened this morning. It was pretty rough. And so we're on our way over, and he's crying in the van. And, we get to the school and more tears, and he's coming out, and he's, no school, no school. And then all of a sudden, this little girl, this classmate of his, she saw him, dropped her backpack and ran across the playground and just wrapped her arms around my son and just held him for a minute, just hugged him real tight. And she was saying something to him. I couldn't tell what she said, but a few moments later, they just walked over together and she started pushing him on the swing. And it was this beautiful moment of just sincere compassion. And it was just a sight to behold. And I was thinking about it after, and just thinking about that amazing little girl and her compassion. And I just wish that everyone was like that. That, specifically as a Christian, I wish more Christians would react that way. But unfortunately, that's not the case all the time. Now, I have a couple points that I want us to consider because for me on my channel, I like to talk about things and apply them to the local church and Christians. How should we do things? And a lot of us don't know what to do with people who are neurodivergent, that have things like autism. What do we do about these people? Well, the first thing that I think we should do is to not be a Greg. Don't be a Greg. Now, what I mean by that is Pastor Greg Locke down in Texas. He went viral a couple weeks ago talking about autism and it being demonic and all that kind of stuff. And it was gross. It was crazy. But the problem with that, other than, him and his church, some people would be like, I would never say something like that. But I've heard a few things that are actually pretty similar to that. Not talking about autism being like satanic, but talking about it as being like a sin, or talking about it as like this illness that needs to be cured through some miraculous healing. I've heard it so often of like, if he would just believe in Jesus, it would be better. He would get better. People have told me that, and that's not accurate. That's a misunderstanding of what autism is. It's also just, just a weird view of what it means to be regenerated and to be in Christ. But I think a lot of us need to reconsider these things like ADHD, being a very mild form of neurodivergence, but things more critical like autism, or even further, we need to really consider how we view these people. And if they're created in the image of God, what does that mean as far as what's going on in their mind? And I think that we really need to think through that a little bit more deeply. So don't be a Greg. Number two would be to be welcoming. And this could be so beautiful within the local church, and unfortunately, it doesn't happen very often. But I just go back to so many times when my son would be acting out in different churches that we were at, and some of the looks that I would get. Now, sometimes, there are kids and they're messing around in church and you're like, hey, pay attention to what's going on, be quiet, all those kinds of things. But the vast majority of people knew who my son was. They knew what was going on with him, and still we'd get looks. Now, sometimes that was, directed at my son and like looking at him like, hey, you better shape up. Or looking at me and my wife and saying like, aren't you going to handle this? Or take him out of the room, like all those kinds of things. Now, unfortunately, that meant that I was constantly taking him out. This is when I wasn't in pastoral ministry, but just attending. I might as well have not have been there because either me or my wife, we would just have to take him out. And I think that a lot of families probably feel that and have had to just constantly take their child out. Well, why is that? If you look through history, a lot of times, like entire families would come into church and it was just like they would just like spend the day there, and it would be loud. I think of like Calvin, John Calvin preaching, and other elders there in Geneva. They would be preaching, and there would be all kinds of things that were happening in the room. And yet people were still able to understand what Calvin was preaching about, or whoever was preaching with him. They would be able to understand, and they would still have all these different things going on. I think we're capable of being able to overlook some distractions in a room, and especially when we know why those distractions are happening, not out of disobedience, but just out of, ask a kid with autism to sit there for an hour and 15 minutes and be absolutely silent, see what's going to happen. Now, also, some other things that a local church can do to be welcoming, other than just, overlooking those moments when someone is loud or noisy, or gets up and needs to walk around in the back, things like that. We could actually make room for these people, maybe an area within the sanctuary where we could have some sensory toys and sensory items, just to be able to, like a little rocking swing or something like that. Those kinds of things help people on the autism spectrum and other neurodivergencies to be able to cope with what's going on around them and be able to work out some of those wiggles that they need to, not just of, a kid who's a little frustrated that the service is taking so long. Why is the pastor still preaching? Things like that, but just physically they can't cope in the moment. Well, why can't we make room for that? So those are just some ways, but think about you in your church. How can you be more welcoming to people like that? And the third thing I would say is to educate yourself. Educate yourself. If you're a pastor, you need to be looking at, what is autism? Like, it's affecting me, but the more that I learn about autism, the more I learn about what's going on even in my city with other families who have children who are autistic, or full-grown adults who are autistic. This is a far more common problem than I knew before, I had a son who was diagnosed with it. This is something that's all over the place. And as a pastor, you need to be thinking through these things. And unfortunately, there's not been a lot of research on this thing. So I've been looking for books that not just, I want to learn, but also to be able to give them to people so they can understand a little bit more about what it's like to have a child on the spectrum, or to be on the spectrum, and what that might entail for them when it comes to involvement in the local church, things like that. And I finally found a book a few months ago that I just thought was so great, and that is On the Spectrum: Autism, Faith, and the Gifts of Neurodiversity. And this is by Daniel Bowman Jr. This book is fantastic. If you are new to the idea of autism, if you haven't done any research and you're just like, what is this thing? I would say this book would be so helpful for you. It is a great introduction to autism, and gives a couple ideas for how you can be a little bit more welcoming toward those who would be autistic in the local church. Not as many as I wanted. Like, I really wanted, like, just give me everything I need to do as a pastor to be more welcoming. But there are some things and some principles in here that if you apply it to the local church, I think that you could be a pretty welcoming place for a family. And let me tell you, from personal experience, that could be such a blessing to a family. So just some thoughts today, kind of a random video today. It's just, like I said, had a rough morning, saw that compassionate little girl, and it just got my mind working a little bit. But let me know what you think. If you have someone in your life who is on the spectrum, maybe some things you've learned, how to involve your faith in that scenario, whether that's, different things the local church can do or just you as a person. I would love to know those things. So I'll interact with you down in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.